So I'm Rick Boland. I'm retired now. I spent a lot of years in gastroenterology. I really enjoyed it a lot. It was just the perfect match for me. Even though I'm retired, I'm still writing and giving lectures and doing lots of things that I enjoy to do, and I don't have any of the harder work. So I got into the medical field. I was one of those guys who at age 5 said I was going to be a doctor. My father was a doctor. He was like a first-generation professional person, and he was very proud of being a doctor, and he brought me up to believe that that was like the top thing that you could do with your life. And so I always, he was my hero. You know, he could do everything. He was a great athlete, he was smart, he was compassionate, he was all those kinds of things, and so I wanted to be like him. Of course, I never got to be quite like him, but I did enter into the medical field. Then he got sick and died of colon cancer during my first year of medical school, and I started to dig into that and realized that as far back as I could trace in the family, there was a lot of colon cancer. So I did my medical school thesis on the idea that there was a form of colon cancer that was hereditary. All the professors at my medical school said there was no such disease, but I would show them the pedigree and I'd say, well, look at this, what's going on here? And they said, well, we don't know, it's probably just bad luck. I said, really bad luck, because my father and grandfather were in their 20s when they first had a colon cancer, and my father was one of 13 siblings. Now, if you do genetics, the one thing that you really like to solve problems or to illustrate the problem is a big pedigree. And so 10 of those 13 got some kind of cancer at some point in time. So from the middle of medical school, so probably by my 3rd or 4th year, I decided I wanted to be a gastroenterologist so I could study this problem. You could either be a medical oncologist or a gastroenterologist. There really wasn't a profession in genetics at that time, and the ability of medical oncologists to treat any kind of cancer was so terrible, I thought it would be better to get into a field where you could at least get inside of a colon and remove polyps or diagnose cancers or something like that. So that was something that I decided on fairly early on. And then I was kind of a late bloomer to want to do research. So I ended up at age 30 deciding, so I spent, after medical school, I did my internship. I was in the Indian Health Service for a couple of years. And then I went back and finished up my residency. I was in San Francisco, and I decided I was going to go into GI, and I was going to go into a laboratory and learn everything I could about, in fact, one of my goals was to know more about colon cancer than anybody else on the planet. A modest goal, unmeasurable, of course. But then I decided I really wanted to go into the laboratory and be in a position to solve this problem of what's this hereditary form. And so that really happened. I went into a laboratory. There was no way, it was impossible in 1979 to solve a problem with the genetic basis of any disease. No disease had been solved or resolved at that level. But I figured that I would go into the laboratory and learn how to do science and learn how to attack problems. And I did that, studying glycoprotein biochemistry for a number of years. And then, you know, just like the skies opened, in the mid-'80s and the late '80s, the whole field of molecular biology opened up, genetics opened up in 1986. The first disease, hereditary disease that was linked to a specific gene, was found. And so it was like I had done the right thing. And then, so, you know, there's one thing to plan your life, and there's the other part of it's good luck. And I had really both of those, especially the good luck part. I've been, and then we made a lot of progress in terms of, in the 90s, the molecular basis of this hereditary form of cancer was uncovered, not by me, but by 3 groups simultaneously finding it. So it was one of those things that was bound to be discovered because everybody was sniffing all around, and we knew there was a scent of something. But it just so happened I had done a sabbatical a couple of years earlier and had focused on these genetic sequences that were the key to the hereditary form of cancer. So all of a sudden, there I was. My goal was to get involved in this, and I was like, there wasn't any competition initially, you know, for a month or two. And so I continued to do that, and then ultimately, my lab found the mutation in my family, the mutation was kind of unfindable. It was a hard one to find, and developed a test for my family, so we tested everybody. So, you know, not that many things that you do in life that you have a long-term plan play out, but this one really did. So In the fall of 2000, my little sister called me up and she said, my son Matt wants to, thinks he might want to go to medical school. He was a junior in college at the time. She said, can he come out next summer and see some patients with you? I said, I have a better idea. Let him come out and work in the laboratory and we'll see what he can do. And we have an idea about how to attack the problem of, of the mutation in the family. And so he came out, he stayed with us, and we jogged in the morning together, we drove into work, and just before he came out, it turns out that the idea that I had of how to solve the problem wasn't going to work. And my laboratory manager was following the Human Genome Project, which was published, the first draft was published in February of 2001, just before he came out. She said, we can't solve the problem the way you have hypothesized you could because of, and there's a genetic explanation for that. So so we tried something else, didn't work initially, and then Matt went into the library and came up with a new technique, and that worked, and he found the mutation. And so it was one night in the laboratory. He had been in the laboratory for 6 weeks. He was a junior in college, and he comes, and I'm listening to the lab manager and Matt tick off the A's, T's, C's, and G's, and then Matt very calmly says, we found it. And I said, you found what? We said, we found Trudy's mutation. And then we had a great dinner that night, as you can imagine. And then I said, okay, now Matt, you still have 2 weeks to go. Oh, by the way, this is on an AGA fellowship too. You know, one of those $2,000 fellowships. And so I said, now you have to develop a test for the family. So, and I knew that because of the nature of the sequences this mutation was buried in, that it was going to be hard. Took Matt one try. Again, luck trumps over all of the issues of your planning or your incompetencies. You get really lucky and good things happen. So I wouldn't necessarily say to somebody be a gastroenterologist, although it was really the right thing for me. I would say find something that really that fits into your skill set, that's something that interests you, something that you are going to be passionate about and follow it to the limits. So gastroenterology just has a lot of opportunities within it, if you think about it. You know, there's the endoscopic side, there's the liver side, there's the gut side, there's the cancer biology, and inflammation, IBD, all that kind of things. You know, and so, for example, my daughter went to medical school. And that was a surprise. She wasn't talking about that until she was maybe in her junior year or something like that. She said, I want to go to medical school. And then she said that she was interested in cancer and inflammation and the microbiome. I said, yeah, they're all part of the same story, you know. And so she said, so I might want to either pursue infectious diseases or gastroenterology. And I said, well, infectious diseases is not bad, and they won't wake you up at night to come in to scope a bleeder. But she went into GI anyway. So there it was. It just, she saw the opportunity. She saw the way I worked, and it was hard, but it wasn't punishing, and it was fun, and she knew that I enjoyed it, and I never had a day where I came home and said, I picked the wrong thing, or I don't want to do this. And so she's now a gastroenterologist as well. And by the way, Matt, my nephew, he's now an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and he's in charge of their Lynch syndrome clinic too. So, you know, so there are two people who went down that particular pathway in life. As I was completely committed to gastroenterology, and I never got that involved in any of the governance of any of the cancer organizations. There were lots of other organizations. There was the Society for Complex Carbohydrates when I was doing carbohydrate biochemistry. But the AGA, because it was so central, because all the issues, you know, whether it's GI biology or GI science or endoscopy, they were all central to the things that were making me passionate about my profession. So I went to my first AGA meeting. It wasn't called DDW then. It was 1978, and I was a resident, and they usually sent the residents to like a 3-day meeting or a 4-day meeting somewhere. And I said, I want to go to the GI meeting. So I went there, and with the chief of GI at my program, and I remember seeing all of these luminaries, you know, and I would look at them like, you know, like it was like, you know, movie stars were going by, and because I had read papers and I recognized this name and that name, and you know, I really had I'm not worthy sort of sense to it, you know. And then I kept going. I've been to every DDW except for 1981. That's the year my daughter Bridget was born, on May 16th, right in the middle of the DDW. But I've been to all the rest of them. And so, initially I would see these people who were the leaders, I would listen to them talk, I would take careful notes, I was really drawn into learning everything I could about gastroenterology. And then little by little you get to know them on a first name basis. And then I got recruited from UC San Francisco to Michigan in 1984. And the guy who recruited me was Tachi Yamada, who was one of the luminaries in the field. And he appointed me to some committee. I don't remember. It was a minor committee. In fact, it was like, we adjudicated how effective the teaching was at DDW. There was a committee on that. And so I put together this very rigorous, I assigned 2 people to each session. Each session we had 2 people, and then I put all the data together and handed it into Tachi. And it was interesting because Tachi didn't get a very high score for his lecture, but I had that in there. So anyways, little by little I got put on other committees, and then your reward for doing a good job on a committee is you get put on the next one. So I ultimately ended up chairing most of the committees over the years, and I got to know people more and more. I loved the organization. I found the staff and everything about the AGA to be a lot of fun, and so it just seemed natural to want to run for president initially. And I had to run a couple times, but that's the way things go. And then ultimately, I got, so it happened so gradually. It was fascinating to look back and going from seeing these heroes, who you'd go to their lectures and you'd be sitting in the back like a little mouse, and then ultimately you're giving the lectures and then you're in the leadership. So it just gradually happened. When I was along the way, you're moving your way along through medical schools. I was on a number of various committees and organizations where we were trained in leadership skills. But there's nothing quite like being on the governing board to see how leadership works. So what I remember most was learning about how organizations work, how people interact, what the modes of communications are, what works, what doesn't. Do you count votes silently before you call for a vote? You say who's going to go for this or who's going to go for that. And to watch how certain people have especially good skill sets in predicting what's going to work and what's not going to work. And Yamada was one of those guys who could really do that. I mean, somebody came up with an idea once to start a magazine, a patient-oriented magazine, and Tachi said, but there's this problem we would have, and then meanwhile, somebody was passing around a magazine from another organization, and somebody says, here's exactly what Tachi was saying, and there it was, and it was like there was a personal ad that was kind of sleazy, and it was in this magazine, and Tachi was saying, if we have a magazine and you're going to support it with these things, that would be a problem. So it was fun to watch really clever people who knew how organizations worked, and then to learn from that, and then to be in a position to try to be an effective leader. Oh, I don't think I was any more special than anybody else. I mean, you do your best to try to keep the organization alive and growing and all the rest of that. We did that. I tried my best because I got asked to do it repeatedly to talk about this story about why I got into GI. And I thought that maybe that was the one thing that made me different from the others, was that I had this really burning motivation to go in and solve a problem and to help other people deal with the same fears that I had at one time. So maybe, if anything, that was something that was different. And just after I got off the governing board, I wrote a book about this too, and so that was out there. So maybe it was that. Oh, and so when I've been involved in some mentoring programs, and I tell these young people who are thinking about going into medicine or whatever, I don't say become a gastroenterologist or become an anything. I just say find something that will really drive you, and then learn everything you can about how to do that right, and then go do it. The AGA is in a good place. I mean, I think it's the leading academic organization, the leading scientific organization in the field of gastroenterology. We've got competitive organizations, or we got organizations we compete with, but I think that we all do complementary things, and I think the AGA, as a leader in the science and in the academics, I think nobody comes close in that regard. So I think we're in a good place, and I think that something that everybody talks about, we had a meeting of the presidents last night, and one of the things that we talk about a lot is how are we going to keep the organization relevant to young people as they're coming in? Because it's not going to be the same. You know, generational ideas change. I remember some of the older people, when I first got into AGA, some of the people who were like a generation or a generation and a half older, and I remember thinking, they're kind of not what I aspire to. Now, there are other people who are not like that, but so I think we have to be very careful not to become outmoded and to make sure that the organization is bringing in the kinds of things that the next generation is going to want and will grow with. You know, so I think it has to do with growth, being dynamic, not getting stuck in the mud. I'm hoping that AGA will continue to stay on top of the science and will present high-quality meetings that people can go to and learn, that we can embrace the broad community, whether it's scientific community or whether it's disadvantaged minorities or whatever, and learn how to reach out and learn how to deliver our care to everybody in a way that people will appreciate. That's another thing is how do you make sure that the kind of care that's being recommended isn't just serving us, you know, particularly, let's say, the business needs or the business desires of some people. We want to make sure, I think we need to make sure that we're always delivering care that's going to make the whole population healthier and happier. And so I think we have to keep our eye on that while we're trying to bring in younger people and trying to fit all the needs of all of our members. It's a complicated business, but you know, there are smart people who will figure all this out. It won't be me. There'll be somebody out there who can do that. I've really enjoyed my career in gastroenterology. It went from wanting to be a clinical gastroenterologist and be able to diagnose cancers and that kind of thing to then running a laboratory. And then I became more and more research focused as time went by. And so what's interesting was the organic nature of my career, how it went through these different pathways. And it was always gratifying, and it was easy to modify as I went to keep doing the things that made me enjoy it. So, I mean, it's just been a fun run.